Magic.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on magic.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magic.me, magick.me. Thank you for being back on the podcast. I think the last time you were on was like 4 or 5 years ago at this point, right?
Yeah, I think it was in 2017 when the last book came out.
Yeah, time goes way too fast. Yeah.
It does, yeah, and it's good to talk to you. I mean,
you too.
So much has happened since then, and things have changed, but they're kind of the same in a way.
So yeah, it's weird how that works. So yeah, maybe just update us. I know I talked to you when your last book came out about journeys in Pagan Europe, journeys in the Kali Yuga, and you've put out a new book called Holy Europe, but it's not out in English yet. Hopefully it's coming out, but this is caused a lot. I mean, this has been a big hit in Europe from what I understand.
Yeah, it's been quite successful in terms of the attention that it's gotten. It took me many years to write that book, sort of 4 years. I think I wrote devoted most of my time to writing the book. So it was a huge amount of work and a lot of personal sacrifice. I mean, there's no real benefit to writing a book for 4 years, as you know. Doesn't make any sense. And but you don't live off of benefit or gain. You live off something else. And this has been sort of my life's work and calling to express something which I find really important and of central significance to my country and to Europeans at large. And so I wrote that book, and that came out in Finland 2020 in December, so just before the start of 21. And it was reviewed by, the biggest newspaper, devoted a whole sort of a section to it and gave it a favorable review and stuff. So I was actually quite surprised by how positive the reaction was, because it still has a lot of things in there which might cause controversy and stuff, but it's surprisingly been sort of appreciated by all of these different polarities, which is what I intended, is what I wanted it to not just be some niche book in some little, little group of people, but to sort of reach a wider audience. Because I do believe that the spiritual tradition is the one thing that is sort of able to bridge the gap and connect people on some higher level than mere, political positions or ideologies or these things which ultimately, separate us. So
that's really true. That's really beautiful. Yeah, and that's what
was trying to aim for that kind of landscape, where we would be united with people in a way.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I mean, that is something really beautiful about spirituality. People definitely get angry whenever I make things political, but because spirituality unifies people from all ends of the political spectrum. And I don't think there's very many other things like that, like music to some extent, depending on the music, nature, there's not a whole lot like that. But what was your, for people who have not been able to read it or either because they haven't got a hold of it, or they just, there's not an English translation yet. What was your kind of central thesis for this book, and what were you trying to get across to people?
Well, it's kind of like, in a way, it's a continuation of the first book, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, because the Journeys in the Kali Yuga really ends in me kind of returning to my homeland and trying to seek the same thing that I found in India, which was a living spiritual tradition. I was trying to look for signs of that, or markers of that, or remnants of that here in what is my home, which is Finland, and to a larger extent Europe. And it's in a way it's similar to the first book. It's travel writing. I mean, it's my personal journey into a lot of these places. I traveled through 9 different sort of branches of the European world tree. So it's 9 different cultures, localities, or sort of cultural areas. And I traveled to these places and I visit holy sites, both Christian and pre-Christian or pagan, and meet people and have experiences. And then I tell of the significance of those places. So it's like historical, religious, spiritual, sometimes artistic sort of content. And then it has this sort of other level where I'm trying to reach, sort of the essence of it, and also like the spirit of our time. So it's a book on many levels, but I am trying to approach the sort of spiritual center, the axis mundi, or the world tree, which would be the uniting thing of these traditions, these sort of separate traditions in Europe. And so I'm trying to find what is the commonality in all these things, because on my journeys I've always found it. I found it in people, with people, at places. I found sort of a commonality, and so I've tried to find what that commonality or what that common thing is, and point to it. And so I don't know if I've, the thing in Europe is that we don't really have lived our they're either very sort of broken or scattered, or then they're waning like Christianity is. So they're all we're sort of, I'm trying to point towards something, a spiritual center.
So what did you in terms of what did you find? I mean, what did you feel that the commonality was? Or because that's something I've tried to figure out quite a lot as well, because like you said, there is no living spiritual, or there's perhaps hard to find living spiritual tradition. And I think we talked about this on the last podcast, and there's, the overlay of Christianity, and then you get things like the Western esoteric tradition, which at the end of the day are also the overlay of Christianity. So I'm just curious what conclusions you came to on that.
Well, I think despite our differences, and despite different languages and sort of cultural customs, I think on a deeper level, we share a sort of common spiritual outlook or understanding, very broadly speaking. I think we have a same way to approach the holy, which manifests both in practical terms. It manifests in the holy places that we have throughout Europe, which are, ranging from natural shrines, sanctuaries, to temples, ancient temples, to churches. And the way that those manifest in physical localities and the way that Europeans approach those tends to be very similar. Like there's similar ways that you approach the holy throughout Europe, and like various similarities in how the sacred or the holy is sort of apprehended or how it's viewed. And I go into this in great detail in the especially in the final chapter of my book, where I sort of laid out what these commonalities are. But I do think that we're part of the same family tree of divinities. And Europe has never been, like these countries that we have now, they're nothing very old in the sense that, the people of Europe have been influencing each other a lot. So like in a cultural area, like in a little place like Finland, where I live, there's a clear influence that goes both ways with the Germanic people, with the Baltic people, and with the Slavic people. And all of these people, for instance, in Northern Europe, have a lot more in common with each other spiritually, even though they have different languages and things, than they have apart. And I'm sort of trying to point to that commonality and to make people realize that we do have, Europe is a holy entity in a way. And if people, I think it's very, very, very important, because I think that's the central thing that Europe has lost in this day and age, is its soul. And this is kind of difficult to talk about, because this is all, like Ernest Hemingway said, that the writer doesn't talk, but he writes, so it's like,
right.
It's difficult to it's like a 500-page book. So it's like, it's got a lot in there.
Right. Well, I think it's just such important work. I think I've said to you on social media, it's like, it strikes me as singularly important work, and particularly for now. And I think that, when I really think about it, when we really sit down and think about whatever this moment, the post-theosophical moment is, it's just a blip in history since 1875, or even more specifically, the neo-pagan revival since the 60s, which we're the inheritors of, in a sense. I mean, the baby boomers started it, but we're kind of inheriting it and trying to make it into something more substantial, perhaps, is that I think, cultures all over the world are trying to recover their own sense of themselves. And we can talk about that in relation to post-colonialism and things like that. But the thing that people don't understand is that post-colonialism applies not only to, let's say, the non-European world, but it also applies to Europe, in the sense that Europe was also colonized earlier by, as I call him, desert god, and, the broad struggle of everybody is against the baneful influence of desert god, or Jehovah, or the demiurge, or whatever we want to say metaphorically and colorfully. And that recovery of self, that, everyone's ancestry and sense of who they are and roots, in the truest sense, connection to the past, was severed. And then people who are severed from their past can be controlled. And I always think about the story of Charlemagne cutting down the Irminsul in Germany and forcing everyone to watch, of literally cutting down the sacred trees and forcing people to watch as the alien desert god cult essentially took over their realities. So, and I think this is something important to understand, that yes, spirituality can be something that you create, it can be a personal thing, but it's also beyond personal. It's also a very critical conversation with ancestors. And that's, I think, a really powerful moment for people when they go from realizing, oh, I'm just a really strange person, to actually, I'm doing the exact same thing my ancestors were. And this isn't just coming out of nowhere. And it is post-colonial in the deepest sense. So, and people don't understand that Europe is in the same situation. So I think that what you're doing is just, absolutely critical work.
Well, thank you. And what you mentioned about Charlemagne cutting down the Irminsul, this is one thing that I write about extensively in a chapter of my book, this cutting down of the tree that happened, and what the Irminsul actually was. Now, the Irminsul is, like, for the listeners, this is a sort of word that is applied to a sort of pillar that's connected with the Germanic people, and it was kind of like, it's thought to have been kind of a totem for a tribe, but it usually represents the sort of the highest god, or the central sort of the center of those people's worlds, and different tribes would have different representations of the Irminsul. So it wasn't always a tree in the literal sense. Sometimes it would be a god pillar out of wood, and that's really sort of the one of the commonalities in all of these European spiritual traditions is this vertical pillar, which all of the European traditions have at their center, is a big oak or a big, tree, a world tree. And that's really the commonality between all this. And the world tree is marking this sort of the spiritual axis, which holds it all together, which is this sort of cohesive power of order, which orients people to around this sacred reality. And so when the sacred reality is cut down or broken or replaced with another one, you will have a lot of problems. And at the same time, I have tried to be fair and not be, anti-Christian or something in this book, because the whole of Europe is based on this tension between Christianity and paganism. Mm. And, that this is really like the essence of Western civilization, is this tension between those two forces, if you look culturally, because they permeate everything of Europe. Is sort of the history, the warring history of the tension between those two sort of impulses. And so I've tried to sort of embrace both in a way, which is difficult for me because, honestly, I'm not a very Christian person, but Christianity also absorbed so many aspects of paganism, the yearly celebrations of Christianity and the saints and all these things. There's so much in Christianity which is over pagan, wise to do that, because they understood that they would be able to sort of get rooted in a culture if they did not sort of adopt its most important things or essential aspects into it. So I'm not trying to be anti-Christian. I'm trying to sort of recognize the spiritual landscape. That's why there's also on the cover of my book is this sort of tree, which has a sun wheel or sun cross in the center, and it's a tree on top of a mountain, and that symbol right there sort of represents this union also of Christianity and paganism, because this sort of sun cross is both a pagan and a Christian motif, and often those things and traditions also overlap. It wasn't always just a war, against the pagans or something. It was Christianity and paganism, for instance, in Finland, they coexisted for a long time. And Christianity influenced, the sort of folkish tradition here and stuff. So I'm trying to be fair and because I don't believe that some sort of return to some primal paganism is really possible. Like these things can only be given new life in a new form or in a new essence in some way. You know what I mean? And I'm also trying to be honest. Like you can't really, like a lot of people nowadays, they'll sort of adopt a spiritual tradition or a path based on what they think is like politically valid or something, or they have these sort of external motivations to choose something that's internal, and you cannot do that. You still have to be, even if there's not a single other person on planet Earth who's it's like feel spiritually like you do. You still have to follow your own inner impulse, doom or gloom. Like you still have to sort of be true to yourself, and you can't choose a spiritual tradition because it's got to be viable in the future or something.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting to hear you say that, because that's something that I haven't been able to reconcile in myself, in the sense that I go back and forth from trying to embrace a completely pagan conception of things to, Christianity, Kabbalah, the Western esoteric tradition, Sufism, like basically but broadly speaking, essentially Christianity and paganism, and I can't do it. I can't reconcile those things. And so it's actually, I can't figure it out. So other than just completely cutting one off, it's actually just kind of reassuring to hear you say that. It's like, well, maybe it's just hardwired that way. That's not really about me. That's maybe that's genetically hardwired just from epigenetic history.
I mean, I think you have to be able to sort of embrace both in a way.
It's also been one thing that's been really interesting to me also on the pagan side, and we're kind of talking about genetics, and now we know about from epigenetics that, essentially everything that you do creatively affects your genetic code. So even genetics are a creative dialogue with the past and the future. So we get them, but we also change them going forward. And so, our whole history is probably to some extent, including traumas and things like that, and aptitudes are recorded genetically. And that's something that people really are just starting to get their head around. But one thing that has really fascinated me recently is now that we have such a knowledge of genetics and post-human genome project and things like 23andMe and things like that, that we know that there actually is an Indo-European genetic family, that there's actually a real thing that includes not just Europe, but northern India. And when I look at it from, like, I remember reading when I was working on editing a biography of Brian Geisen by John Geiger many years ago. And one of the things that Geisen was always obsessed with was genetic groups and how they moved across the planet and how that essentially determined everything, not just how they believed, but their outlook and how they interacted with each other, but in a really deep sense. And so it's interesting to me to consider, well, if there actually is, I forget the genetic designation for it, but if there actually is a genetic family that includes Europe and northern India, well, if you look at it that way, European paganism and particularly northern Indian paganism, Tantra, they're very similar. They seem to, and you talked about one family of gods. I mean, if you look at, there's even migration of gods between ancient Greece and India. There's a lot of evidence that, for instance, I think both Sobek and Ganesh, possibly Ganesh, but definitely Sobek Sobek is an Egyptian god, but those two gods may have passed back and forth between India and Greece, and we just know that in the ancient world everything was fluid. So that has been really interesting to me, and particularly in light of your work of looking at both of Indian paganism and European paganism. Do you think that there's something to that in the sense that it may have just been one group of people across one geographic area?
I absolutely think that there's something to that. Now, whether or not these were a historical, group or not, I'm not a historian, so I can't really say on that. I mean, there are a lot of theories. I don't know if you read Alain Danielou.
Yeah, I've read his writing on yoga, but that's it.
Yeah, well, he has a book called, for instance, Shiva and Dionysus, I think. And a lot of his work is based on this idea that he thinks that there was a kind of religion that extended to the West and the East, and that Shiva and Dionysus were sort of different cultural manifestations of the same thing, and one survived in a way and one didn't. And I absolutely think that there is a very strong connection between so-called Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, or Tantra, or the Indian esoteric tradition and European paganism. And that's why I went to India, because I sort of wanted to see how this paganism could sort of manifest in the modern world. Now, one can argue if India is modern or not, but like in at least in contemporary times, how a paganism could, still sort of exist and how it would look. And I do find that that's the closest sort of representative of what European paganism, had it survived, would probably look like in some sense, So I do think that there's a lot that can be learned simply from studying Indian tradition also, which, to an extent, I think mirrors a lot of European paganism. Whether we are talking about, classical sort of Greco-Roman paganism or the sort of oldest southern strains of that, or even the ones that we have up north, because even between those, there are clearly many similarities. And I was also told as much when I was in India. And of course, when I was in India, I was only part of one tradition. And as you yourself know, it's kind of, in India, it's like you kind of have to, sort of choose, perhaps one line or one path to walk down on, and then sort of that's your source for it. And you can't sort of talk about everything, but at least in the tradition that I talked to with the gurus there, they seem to think that there was a strong connection between the Northern European paganism and what they were doing.
That's really interesting, and it just seems to be self-evident to me at least at this point in my life. It didn't necessarily seem like that before when I didn't have a lot of experience, but certainly other people have come to that conclusion, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's probably for that reason that a lot of, and actually when I realized that, I stopped being kind of so, let's say, cynical about, kind of Western hippies who take on the kind of Indian persona, or, kind of do like the Russell Brand type thing where they kind of do this Hindu devotee thing. And I guess I was only cynical about that probably because it reminded me of things that I had done. So I'll be fair about that. But when I thought about that, because previously I thought, well, if people are going to embrace spirituality, why do they immediately have to go to another country and adopt a completely different cultural identity and start dressing differently and start wearing beads and be something other than what they are, other than their own spiritual heritage? But then I started to realize, well, maybe that's actually not what's happening. Maybe that's just the best place to go to recover a sense of what things were like. Maybe it's not a break at all from one's own tradition. And I think that's probably true for both of us, having such an intense experience in India and with Indian traditions here. So that was really interesting for me to think about in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much that, and by the way, like, I completely agree, and I was the same way. Before I went to India, when I was younger, I thought, when I saw people sort of turn to the East, I was sort of like, why can't you find that here? And, but of course it is very difficult to find it here. And I'm also less cynical towards people now that do that or have done that. And of course, to a certain extent, I've done it myself, so I can't really
yeah, I have too.
Criticize other people.
Well, we always criticize people that remind us of ourselves. That's kind of what I was saying. So,
Of course, yeah. It's the old Jungian thing, how you you hate the things about other people that are essentially about yourself. Well, but there's an idea in Finnish tradition that your soul is composed of these three parts. And one of those parts is something that is like it's sort of like a soul part which you inherit from your family. And that's reborn into the same sort of family line. And I think that expresses this idea that, there's so much that you inherit in terms of memories and things that you're attracted to, and that you feel are powerful and that resonate with you. And I think if people try to listen to those things and follow those things, I think they will find, as hard and elusive as that path is, I think they will find the right path if they listen to those streams. We have a lot of things which do guide us in the right direction if we can manage to open ourselves up to them. We're not blank slates, tabula rasa, that are just thrown into the world, and we have no connection to anything. Clearly we do, and I've noticed that if I've followed a strong spiritual or even not, it doesn't even have to be spiritual. It can be something very elusive, just an image or a clue to something. If I just follow these things which I sense or have sort of very vague memories of, I've been on the right path, and they've always led me down to where I'm supposed to be going. Now, the India thing is such that I think we have a lot to learn from India, and I think it's an admirable tradition. But at the same time, a lot of water has flown, between us and Indians, and we are not them. And it would be foolish to try to adopt the outer appearance or the outer trappings of a culture like India. Europeans cannot become Indians and Hindus. We kind of have to rediscover that thing for ourselves. And that was my main reason also, for returning in a way to my own spiritual tradition, because I just realized that this is not this would be open for me now to do, but I'm ultimately not an Indian. And I have a family here. I have roots here. I belong here. And Europe is my family. And so it's this thing we have, and that's a much more difficult path, of course. But that's the path I've set upon, and Holy Europe is sort of my honest attempt to point towards something. And I'm not even claiming that I have the absolute truth. And when you read this book, you're gonna find it, and it's easy. And it's not easy. It's a very difficult thing. We are a lost people. We're a culture that is facing many inner and outer enemies and problems and dilemmas. But I am trying, I have made a sincere attempt to try to point to the fleeting divinities of our culture. Because as you were talking about colonizing and things like that, Europe has always been a very for a long time, it's been a very externally oriented culture. So we've always expanding, conquering, going beyond and doing this sort of Faustian thing. But at the same time, we've sort of ignored and forgotten our own soul or our own spirit, or displaced our own spirit. And I think that soul has to be reclaimed and found again. And it has to be listened to, and it has to be given a voice again, if we are to survive, as peoples and as a culture and civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true of everyone. That's true of everyone on the planet. But I only have my own perspective on things to judge from. And I clocked fairly early on that it was actually much more honest to just be clear about where you were coming from genetically, culturally, and embrace that, rather than try to pretend to be something else, which is a much easier politically. And I think what you were touching on there is, what I was thinking is one of the reasons why it's much harder to look at the sacred tradition of your own background is when you are a tourist in somebody else's world, which is ultimately kind of all you can be. For instance, in India, and you're looking at those traditions, and you don't have a political stake in it, not really, other than the fact that you're a Westerner in that world. I mean, that's another question, but you don't really understand the politics of where you are. And so for that reason, it's easier to kind of look at just the purely technical or spiritual aspects of something, and often sometimes have a clearer view on them because of that. But as soon as you begin to assess the spiritual heritage of your own background, well, that you're politically invested in. And that means the nature of everything around you. And obviously this doesn't apply specifically to Europeans. It applies to everyone. I mean, you can't divorce everyone that you see around you from that history. You can't divorce political battles that are happening now in the media sphere or the political sphere, often arguments or lines of division within your own family or your own family history. And one thing that, I've been spending a lot of time going back into my own family records and history and finding, all this stuff that I had no idea about. Like that, for instance, my ancient distant ancestors were snake worshipping, Vanir worshipping pagans and things like that, which is pretty awesome. But these are things that my family has no conception of, partly because the information wasn't available until recently because of genetic testing, but also because, at least in America, and I think Europe also, people are very much encouraged to be tabula rasa, as you put it, to essentially have no connection to anything else, to be a blank spot for global capital to write on, to use as a human resource, to move around the world as essentially just a movable resource, just like it was capital flowing through the market, and that is obviously for a reason, because people who have, totalitarian governments always, or systems always, go to great lengths to cut off the connection of people from anything that is not them. And that is true across the entire political spectrum. And in our current kind of capitalist, neoliberal, free trade world, whatever it actually is, it is not, we're in this kind of strange place where people have been utterly cut off from their heritage, their roots, their families, their backgrounds, their own identity as anything separate from the forces of capital, except that there is this strange loophole in our culture where as long as it's a product that you can buy, then you can have it. You can buy the trappings of your culture. You can buy books on it. You can consume. It can be, as long as it's an experience that you can consume through capitalism, then, unlike perhaps in communist countries, you can have at it. But otherwise, even that's not real, because it's something that you've consumed. It's not organic. It didn't come out of your own family, essentially. So, yeah. So there are, when you return to that, there are political battle lines that are immediately discovered and are inescapable. And I'm just kind of expressing my thoughts of what I was thinking as you were saying, and then suddenly it becomes much more real, for better or worse.
No, that's very true. I mean, talking personally, I think journeys in the Kali Yuga was much less a political, or it didn't have as much at stake, as you said, exactly for the reasons that you expressed. I can't take part in India in that way. But when I write about Europe, which, that's my home, and, I consider myself, I'm from Finland, but genetically I have ancestry also in the wider Northern European sphere. And I also don't think that you're just like defined by your genetics. I think you're also, spiritually, you're essentially spiritually defined as a person, I think. And I am a European. I feel a kinship with all Europeans, all the way from the northern, icy slopes of Iceland to southern Sicily. I can feel a cultural, historical kinship and a sense of communion with Europeans on a spiritual level. And I think that's the Holy Europe that I'm also trying to express. And it's also like, it's my home, it's the home of my families and my family and my grandparents and things. And yeah, of course, then when you're trying to capture something of the time that we live in and that you are invested in, and I have, I'm a father and stuff, so I'm also thinking ahead of how things will go in the future. There is a point where you have to put your foot down and you have to say things which you think are true, whether or not those things align themselves with the current accepted opinion. And that is certainly the case with this book, Holy Europe, where I did try, and I do try to keep it on this sort of higher level, and I try to see nuance in things, but I cannot not comment on things that I see. Like, for instance, when I'm traveling in a city, I'll have to describe that city. And the way that I describe that city, or the people, or what is happening in that city, or events that takes place in that city, that will that will evidently be political. It's sort of inescapable, because how you frame it and how you express it will be, it's going to be from a perspective that's informed by your subjective understanding of things. So yeah, that is inevitable. And I've just tried to not get dragged down into the mire of these party politics and on which side you are on things and stuff. But I do express controversial in today's terms, like ideas or thoughts, reflections in this book. But surprisingly, it has been appreciated by, both the right and the left. So it's been sort of all across the board that the people have been able to appreciate what I'm trying, at least to do. I don't know if how successful I am, but at least I'm trying to do something which would not be divisive, and not sort of drag down. And then the other thing you said about how all these sort of capital or totalitarian governments always suppress these spiritual traditions. I mean, that's incredibly true on both sides of the political sort of spectrum. Whereas like in communist states, which I write about, I write about this quite a bit with regards to the Baltic states in my book, is that, people who even sang songs, these ancestral holy songs about their gods, they have this tradition in Lithuania and Latvia of singing these dainas, which are these sort of long god chants. They sound like a little bit like Indian traditional songs in a way. I mean, these people were sent to the camps, to forced labor camps in Siberia, and you could not practice paganism or your ancestral faith in the Baltic countries when it was ruled over by the Soviet Union. And that became that was very true in Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, which I visited and which I write about extensively. But it was also true in National Socialist Germany. Like, people always connect paganism or Nordic paganism to the Nazis. And that's really misinformed, because the Nazis, they had their own ideology, which was National Socialism, which was a new ideology coded with trappings of paganism. But it wasn't paganism. It was a political totalitarian ideology. And as an example of this, I write in the book about how, for instance, runologists, meaning people who explored runes in an academic or magical sense, the people who explored those things in the wrong sense were sent to the camps, like Friedrich Marby, who was the developer of this sort of runengymnastik, kind of rune gymnastics, where like runic stance. They take these bodily positions and things. And a lot of these people who were runic mystics in Germany, in Nazi Germany, they were not accepted at all as a part of the situation. Even a lot of them who wanted to be, some of them who wanted to be part of the system or the National Socialist regime, they were not accepted, sort of nature mystics and stuff. So it's very true what you say, that this kind of spiritual tradition or ancestral tradition is kind of a force that is always suppressed by these totalitarian governments.
Yeah, and I think I just think that's a very straightforward mechanism. There's not a whole lot. You don't have to dig very deep to understand that. It's not like conspiratorial or something like that. It's just simply that totalitarian governments don't like competition for people's attention or ultimately devotion. But so anything that's taking people away from complete immersion in the state is to be dispensed with under totalitarian regimes. And ours is a little different in the sense that, it can be sold, but in traditionally totalitarian governments, it's just the mob doesn't want competition, yet at the same time will happily take on the trappings of essentially people's pre-existing beliefs in as much as they can to manipulate them. And it's clearly that was true about National Socialism. It's clearly true about Putin, which we can talk about. But it's also definitely true of, at least Europe is more secular now, but it's definitely true of America in the sense of, people like George W. Bush claiming to be, Christian crusaders while they, just completely destroy things and raid oil. And, every American president has to pay, consistent lip service to what a great Christian they are. They don't, but of course they have no interest in it. It's merely to manipulate voters. So, and I think you can make probably the argument that American Christianity has about as, at least in the broad political and commercial sphere, has about as much to do with Christianity as perhaps National Socialism had to do with traditional Nordic paganism. It's just a kind of monstrosity created out of pure expedience. So maybe this is a good time to segue into talking about Russia, because that was, at least in theory, kind of what we were going to talk about on the podcast. So I did see.
But I think this is a good. I mean, this is a good starting point. Discussion.
Absolutely.
Because I don't want it to be all about Russia and current things, and like I think it's good that if people listen to this, they will sort of understand my background a little bit, or where I'm coming from, what informs me.
Yeah, definitely. And I saw you post on Instagram, kind of that this moment of Russian invasion of Ukraine is obviously a shocking moment for everyone, but is also kind of a moment for European people in Europe to assess what being European means. And that's a good place to hop off on. But also, we were talking about how regimes use ideology, and of course part of the Putin regime has been to use against all odds, the ideology of traditionalism and Duginism. And that has been, I think, essentially a propaganda tool for manipulating people in the West, in the sense. And I think that, my take on the Russian style of information warfare or propaganda is that it's probably not that different from American, which is essentially they just seize on every dissident element of a society from every single political aspect, and then, amplify and accelerate that to sow division within the country. And I think that was true in the 60s. It's true now. It's just the political lines change a little bit. So I don't truly think that Putin has any investment at all within this kind of Duginist vision of a traditional Eurasia or, a revitalized Eastern Christendom. But it's certainly a propaganda tool that they use in the West and they use online. And as I think we were talking about on social media, a lot of people have got taken in by. So maybe that's just a good place to talk about it. But also, the most pressing thing is you're in Finland, which borders Russia. And so this is not abstract for you. Finland and Russia have been to war before. It's, I imagine, quite much more existential for you. So the first thing, before we get into all of that, the first thing that I'm most interested in is, what is it like there? What is people's mood? What is the sense in Finland? Are people worried that there is going to be Russian incursion? I just, if you can kind of paint for the listeners what that's like, I would love to start there.
Okay. I'll start with this. We have mandatory military service in Finland, right? For all men. And this is because of Russia. Sweden doesn't have mandatory military service as we do. When I was in the army, when I was 19 years old, which is over 20 years ago, they kept talking about the enemy. There was all this talk about, when they would have lectures on strategy, on what to do and things, there was always talk about the enemy. And at some point, somebody asked, who is the enemy? And the captain said, or whoever, I don't remember the rank of the guy, but he said that the enemy is the same one for us that it's always been, and pointed east. So for us, Russia is the perpetual, enemy in a way. And I always thought, like, most of my adult life, I thought that was perhaps exaggerated and outdated. I didn't really believe that was the case. I wasn't worried. But, 3 weeks ago, that changed. And now I realize that is a reality still. And like more urgently than at any point during my lifetime. And I think that same sense of this is very prevalent among the Finnish people. People are clearly very worried for a reason. I mean, we have an unpredictable neighbor, an expansive neighbor that has a history of overtaking areas which previously have belonged to them. And I don't think that they've ever quite sort of given up on the idea that, Finland was once part of Russia and so forth. So I think the general sense is a kind of awakening to the reality that, this is where we're at sort of again, and we need to be alert. So I think generally, there's some fear and anxiety and apprehension about that. A lot of people are contacting the military, and going into training and doing these kinds of things and looking into like having food if there's a problem and all these kinds of things. So people are sort of looking into practical ways of sort of preparing for the worst. Now, I don't necessarily think that anything's going to happen, but I do think it is a possibility because we are in a volatile situation. We have a superpower as a neighbor that has threatened nuclear weapons and that has threatened with, what was it? What was it? The expression that Putin used, like never before seen consequences if Sweden or Finland would join NATO. So this is clearly a real situation that we need to be aware of. And just as a historical sort of analogy, I remember the way that my grandmother viewed the Soviet Union, which it was then when I was a child. It was not a very pleasant way that she viewed them, for a very, very good reason. And my father was, had to go into the bomb shelter when he was a kid, when they were bombing Helsinki. My mother was sent as a child to Sweden abroad, for was it 3 months or something, where she forgot how to speak Finnish, probably because it was a traumatic experience for her as a child to be sent to another country to completely, strange people to be taken care of in the countryside of Sweden so that she would be safe. So, I mean, these are real memories that live on, I think. And there is certainly an apprehensive atmosphere in the air. And I think a lot of people who live more farther away from, I mean, somebody said that the bear, the so-called bear, looks all the better the farther away you are from it. And unfortunately, living next to it, we don't have that luxury here. And especially when that bear has nuclear weapons. So, I mean, what can you say? You have to be prepared. And I am very disappointed by a lot of elements that I see on the right who are very sympathetic towards Russia. And I see that it seems like most of it is just motivated by this sort of ultimate resentment towards the US. And they think that everything is about the US, and US is like the motivator of all these things that are happening. US has provoked the invasion of Ukraine, as if the Ukrainian people wouldn't have a will, to action themselves, and wouldn't be, sort of, they are also a player in this. They're not just a pawn of some global superpowers. So I have been quite disappointed when I've seen this thing where it's like people are rooting for Russia and thinking that Russia is some sort of great liberator. And I can tell people it's not. It's not a great liberator. And Putin is not going to liberate you. And he's not some based superhero. Like this is nonsense. And I find it stupid and offensive, to be honest.
Yeah, I've been I really have been thinking a lot in the last week, partly because we're going to have this interview, but also just in general in the cultural moment, just like really sitting down and reevaluating how much my reactions to this have been kind of inappropriately on autopilot. Let me put it that way. And what I mean by that, and I really started thinking about this, I think my basic political outlook for pretty much my entire adult life, like a lot of Americans my age, I think, was pretty much, when I look on it in retrospect, formed by Noam Chomsky and people that his opinions had formed, like Bill Hicks, for instance. But I remember, like kind of the basis of my political outlook on the world is I remember reading an essay by Chomsky when I was 17, where he basically says that America, to function as an empire, always needs an external enemy, or our internal divisions cause us, like we can't maintain a global empire without an external enemy. And that since the Soviet Union fell, kind of the assumption that Chomsky makes is, well, the world is peaceful, there's no need for war, yet we still need to justify the American security state. So that America has been looking around since the 80s for external enemies that can fill, since the late 80s, that can fill the role that the Soviet Union once did. And he points out that, in the late 80s, people probably don't remember this, but it was Latin American drug dealers like Manuel Noriega. And then, later it became, and also domestic drug dealers, but later on it became, the war on terror. And, Chomsky's point is that all of these are largely manufactured, that there is no, I think as Bill Hicks later put it, he said this in the early 90s, the only countries that conceivably pose a threat to America are the ones that we arm first in order to justify going to war with them. And then, everybody gets rich from the defense contracts or the oil, or we're justified in invading. And I sat down and thought about it, and I realized that, like, if I really look at it, that's basically been my political outlook for pretty much my adult life. And because of that, I've always been immediately cynical about any conflict that the West gets into, or, my immediate reaction to, for instance, saying hospitals are being bombed in Ukraine is, well, they told us that infants were being taken off incubators in Iraq, and that wasn't true. And they told us all, it's like, it's more, they're just trying to manipulate us into war again. Who knows what's really happening? But I sat down, I thought, well, maybe this is actually not appropriate. Like, maybe I need to sit down and, reassess my fundamental thinking on this, because the reality is that that's not necessarily the case anymore. I don't think that you can, yes, you can kind of make the argument that Russia is responding to NATO incursion, but I don't know. I mean, it seems pretty clear cut at this point who the aggressor is. And it seems, as you say, in the last 3 weeks, we've suddenly been put into probably a completely new world where all of a sudden it seems like World War II again, and nuclear weapons are back on the table. And so suddenly it's like this feeling of being jarred out of this kind of spoiled era of just, oh yeah, everything's fine. If there's conflict in the world, it's just America's fault. And ironically, I think as you're pointing out, there's a real kind of arrogant and perhaps you could even say kind of nationalist or even ethnocentric view of that, where it's like, if anything happens in the world, good or bad, we did it, and other people don't have agency. And like you said about Ukrainians, like that's ridiculous. It's like, it's completely ridiculous. But that kind of assumption has been with a lot of people. Maybe it comes from Chomsky or what. It's like, if anything goes wrong, well, just America secretly did it. And I just don't think that's the case. And so I've really been sitting down and like thinking about just my immediate reaction to it. And I was kind of, even on Instagram, I was kind of posting some cynical memes about it and things like that. And it's like, then I started to think about it. It's like, well, what do I really, what do I really know about this? I don't think anything can be taken for granted anymore. And I think your point about people being driven by resentment on the right is certainly in America definitely true of people on the left, the ideological left, not the middle of the road left. And there is a lot of kind of just, well, as long as it hurts America, it's good. But that doesn't quite look the same now as it might have a few years ago. I don't know.
Yeah, somebody pointed out that the sort of by the way, when I say right, this is a huge term which means a different thing in America on a mainstream level than it does in Europe. And then there's all these traditionalist rights or the dissident right or whatever. I mean, a lot of these people who are on the right and are pro-Russia, they sound like, somebody pointed, I don't remember who it was, who said to me that they sound like the 70s leftists. Like in the same way they have a resentment towards the US, which is so great that anything which hurts the US is good. But I mean, I do find it really interesting that we live in a time where we can follow a war through the media like live, and we can see the massive propaganda which obviously exists on both sides. Now, this is the difficult thing. Is like, it's really hard to get true information because we live in a time where reality is constructed, and whoever controls the narrative is really, that's the winner who gets the story. And so neither the Russian or the Western media is unbiased or sort of reporting on things. There's construct. Did you see the thing about there was all these deep fake things where it's like constructed talks about Zelensky?
No,
the Ukraine.
I saw that people were putting up like clips from video games and claiming that it was war footage.
That was one of them. But there was another one where it was a constructed video of the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, telling Ukrainians to surrender, and it was fake.
Wow.
But this is the time we live in where you have to be, you cannot trust what you hear or see even on these videos. And I mean, it's a very difficult thing to see what's going on. And to add about this, what you said about this resentment and stuff, I was listening to your podcast. I don't remember what episode it was, but you were talking about conspiracies. And you said, I don't remember quite how you put it, but you talked about conspiracies are these things that people construct so that to explain why they have no power,
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the same, like the same people that are now saying, taking the pro-Russian side are the same people who had the complete COVID conspiracy theory sides to things during the pandemic. which is not to say that I wouldn't have been critical, of the measures taken against COVID myself, but just this sort of, complete conspiracy stuff about these things. Now that it's like the same sort of logic is applied to this conflict, to this war, where it's like, oh, it's all put up by the US, and it's all manipulated, and it's ultimately saying that they don't have any power to say this, and the countries that are involved have no power, no agency.
Right.
And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's a good position to have. And I'm not going to speculate on, what Putin is thinking, but what is clear is that he does have interests, economic, cultural, political interests of power relating to Ukraine. And he's being a gangster. He's trying to retake the position of Russia as an empire, whether that harkens back to the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Russia. But people in Russia recognize this, that he's retaking their role as this big empire. And the idea that they're going to invade this country and just bomb the shit out of it, and that Ukrainians are somehow going to accept that. Like, Ukrainians will never accept the Russians as their brothers now with what has happened. This will be a conflict that will go on. Or even if the war goes out, this will be a conflict between these people for a long time to come, I think. Because what are the number of casualties of this thing already? And the fact that people, online, I by the way, I really dislike when people have these sort of post-snide memes and all this shit. It's like, it's like real human suffering. Countless people have lost their lives. Homes are destroyed. Cities are destroyed. A whole people's world is destroyed. And people are being snarky online. That's such a cowardly, pathetic way of being. And I don't understand why people behave like this. But I do find that a problem, that, the way to annex a country is not to bomb them. Like, if these are your brothers and you're sending in Chechenian troops to overtake them, it's like, okay, this is not gonna end well. And I've seen this thing where they should just, the Ukrainians should just surrender, and it's the fault of all these ultra nationalists that they don't just surrender. But you can't really just, when a big superpower comes and demands something, you can't surrender. You can't just lay down your weapons and be like, okay, you take part of our country. That's not what Finland did, and when the Russia attacked Finland, everybody was like, okay, they're not gonna, they're not gonna make it, but we did, and it's like, it wasn't an option, like which side you are on or something. And this is the same thing with this conflict right now. It's like, I don't really have an option which side I'm taking. And I have to kind of take the side of the small guy here, because I kind of know how that feels in a sort of very deep cultural way. I understand the small guy against living in the shadow of this big empire. And by the way, I'm not very positive towards the US either. I'm certainly not. I think both are corrupt superpowers, both Russia and the US, and I'm not rooting for either one of them. But in this case, it's not like we're under threat by America, where I live, where I have a family and a house, is not threatened by anybody else but a certain superpower to the east.
Right. I think that's probably... I mean, at the end of the day, you have to take the side that you're already on, because there's a word for people who take the other side, and it's traitor, right? So I think that the things are kind of that clear again. And why don't you, there's a bunch of stuff I wanted to riff on in there on the propaganda front, but rather than doing that right now, I think I want to ask you about Finland's war with Russia, because I don't think that people in the US really have any awareness of that history. And, maybe, I'm even fairly unclear on it, other than the fact that Finland won and had the best sniper in world history, but,
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, we have been a country not for that long, for like 100 years. We used to be part of Sweden way past in history. Sweden lost Finland to Russia, then we were part of Russia, and then we finally gained independence. And during the last war, Russia tried to take annexed parts of Finland, which used to be Karelia, namely, which used to be a part of Finland. And I think if people want to get a more general history of this, it is and this is very World War history. So we lost a part of Finland called Karelia. This is also, where a lot of these runic singers and these spells and things survive the longest. So these oral traditions, the spiritual traditions, survived the longest in Karelia, which was parts of it were lost to Russia in the last war. And this is like one of those things where people are like, well, it's better to live in Russia, and Russia is a civilizing culture and things. And I mean, people say this like it's Ukraine is a poor country and Russia has a better living standards and all these things. It's like the living standard in the places which were overtaken by Finland is not good. I mean, those places are impoverished and poor and not very good. And Finland has one of the highest living standards on the planet. So I think I know where I want to live in this conflict situation.
You mean the parts of Finland that were lost to Russia, that are on the Russian side now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a lot of alcoholism, displacement, poverty, just things being abandoned. They're shitholes, basically, like to put it in a very blunt and horrible way. But yeah, it's not good. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't like me describing it in this way, but like compared to what it was or what Finland is, that's what it seems like. And I have a sense that a lot of people like don't have an idea of what Russia is actually like. And I understand that people admire sort of classical Russian culture and old things. And I mean, there is so much great Russian classical culture, composers, art, writers, all of this stuff that exists there. But contemporary Russia, if people think that contemporary Russia is somehow more pure or based than the West or something, what is so great about contemporary Russia? Like, what is it? Cheap vodka, crocodile,
right.
Like the massive poverty that people have there, the massive difference in the rich and the poor in that country. Like, what is it? What is it? Techno? Shitty cars, or those, videos that you see where people have car crashes in Russia, like plastic furniture. I don't know. I'm just saying, like, I think people have an illusion of what they think Russia is, which isn't the reality of Russia. And like these draconian measures that Russia has taken to suppress any criticism of these war measures, that's one of the aspects of Russia, like the freedom of speech aspect, which is a reality when it comes to this situation in Russia, that you are not able to say whatever you want there without consequences,
Right. I saw a video.
So I think it's like people live under these illusions, these, that this is that they're the somehow more pure, but the unfortunate thing is that they're not, and we can't escape this by looking for messiahs or these wonderlands, which only exist in fantasies. And we look towards these leaders, whether they be, state leaders, presidents, and think that, yeah, this person is going to make it all okay. And they're not going to make it all okay. That's the reality of the current world situation.
So how was Finland able to beat Russia? And what did that look like?
Well, it was very, of course, Russia like had a army that was way greater than Finland, but it's one of these things. Like I guess Finland had motivation. They had motivation to fight for something. I think that's the same thing. Like in a way, I can see that in the Ukraine now. I mean, they're clearly fighting those people for something, and it's when you fight for something that's kind of your world, then you really fight quite hard,
Yeah, I think that's probably true across. That just seems to be an inflexible rule of warfare across any time in history, and that cities are nearly impossible to take. And
it's interesting, like this whole nationalism thing. Suddenly nationalism is no longer a swear word at all.
And that is interesting,
even among the left.
Yeah,
like it's now all like I can see all these Finnish, leftists on social media and stuff, and everybody's a nationalist. Suddenly,
that is
it's
interesting.
no longer. Suddenly it's no longer like. There's no people and it's all multicultural. There's nothing. It's like, no, suddenly there's very strong people. There are people, and those people belong in a certain country.
Right.
And they have the right to sovereignty and to defend themselves and have freedom and to self-rule.
Yeah, that is interesting. So people stop playing John Lennon Imagine There's No Countries. They stop that real quick.
Very quick. And all this like woke nonsense goes away immediately because people have real pressing concerns about survival, and they have real fears. So all this ultra sensitive nonsense goes out the way because people are generally concerned about real things and not being offended by everything in the world all the time.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, I don't want to say interesting because it's not going to be good, but just as a figure of speech, over the coming months and potentially years, because I think at this point, the conflict with Russia or looming conflict of Russia is not going to go away at any point during our lifetime. And I don't think from here on out, there is not going to be a time when massive rearmament isn't happening. And that's unfortunate because, we all wanted global peace, but that, here we are. It's kind of like the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, but
yeah, do you remember I read you that little passage from Hermann Hesse, Demian, written like over 100 years ago?
Yeah, do you want to read that on the podcast? Actually, that was great.
Yeah, I could read that. It's like it's from Hermann Hesse, a very famous German author who was a pacifist, by the way. And he wrote this book called Demian. And he wrote this right after the First World War. And during one of the hardest periods in his life, his wife had was suffering from mental illness. And it was like the whole world was falling apart when he wrote this. And he wrote this novel, Demian, which is basically about sort of an integration of the complete self and a sort of a finding of the higher self or something like that, which is represented by this external person in this novel. But there's a section that I sent to you, Jason, that sounds like it could have been written today. Let me just find it and I will read it. Here it is. Yes, my friend, it has started. I'm sure you knew about our very strained relation with Russia. What? Are we at war? I never thought it would happen. He spoke quietly, even though there was no one else around. It hasn't been declared yet, but the war is on. Rely on it. Since that other time, I haven't bothered you about this business. But in the meantime, I've seen new omens three times. And so it won't be the end of the world or an earthquake or a revolution. It will be a war. You'll see how popular it will be. People will be in raptures. Even now, everybody's looking forward to a scrap. That's how dull their life has become. But you'll see, this is just the beginning. Maybe it'll turn into a big war, a very big war. But even that is only the beginning. New times are dawning, and for those who cling to the old, the new will be horrible. So that's very sort of suitable to our time.
Unfortunately. Yeah, and
Yes.
You said that was written 100 years ago.
Yes, at the end of World War I.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was just thinking as you were reading that, at least in the US and on social media, people are, enraptured in a way. They're kind of treating it like it's a video game or a Marvel movie because it's not real to them. But I think it's very clear. And, it's like, we were talking about propaganda. It's like, it's basically the first war that's being fought on TikTok. We have TikToks about it. Biden briefed TikTokers in the White House about how they could help with the war effort, essentially. It's just bizarre. But it is clear to me, Biden has used the word World War III, or the phrase World War III many times now. He's saying that he's trying to avoid it with economic sanctions. But but I think that we are in war. We are in World War III. The only thing preventing us from realize, we just don't want to believe that it's happening, essentially. Maybe I imagine that's not a luxury in Finland, but here it's still, people are just seeing it in the media, so it's just kind of unreal to them. But yeah.
No, I think you're right. And it's way more real when you live closer to it. It's like there's no escape from it. Like I've been to the military. I've done a soldier's oath, so this is a real thing for me. And I have my family is from here and stuff, so it's a real thing. And also that I don't believe for a second that Putin is any kind of traditionalist or something.
No.
And I think somebody like Alexander Dugin has very limited influence, if any influence, on Putin. But he has an influence on, the climate and on these intellectual spheres, how people view these things. And before we were talking, I sent you this message that somebody had sent to him asking, does his view of empire include, does Dugin's view of the greater Russian empire include Finland? And he answered, not now, which is kind of telling of something.
What is your take on that?
He said that same thing many times,
okay,
or made similar statements many times when he was visiting Helsinki in 2014, as a part of this pro-Russia, anti-fascist coalition, whatever it was. He said similar things to a major, or at least that was what was represented in one of the major magazines here. And he said things to that effect in the past. And he's usually for annexation of these, smaller states into Russia. So I wouldn't be surprised. And somebody sent me a map of these different sort of, the idea of this, these different sort of areas of geopolitical power. And in this map, these Eurasianists, their view of the greater Eurasia, Russia, went straight through the middle of Finland and the Baltic countries. So I think if you're going to draw like a map of things, you should be quite precise. I mean, granted, I'm sure it was like meant to be a sort of a general map of cultural spheres or something, but you have to be a little bit more precise than drawing maps like that go through countries,
right?
That are sovereign countries. So I think, but the point is that Dugin is not, he's not the only one that has these ideas, but these kind of ideas about the greater Russia, about the empire, about this great big power, they've always existed and lingered in Russia, and also after the fall of the Soviet Union, these have always existed. They have never truly gone away. Even when it comes to something like Finland, where we have that was quite a long time ago already these things, happened. But these ideas have never truly disappeared, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So we have to be realistic that, and the thing is, you can't really predict Russia. Like that is the thing. It is an unpredictable.
Clearly, yeah. Nobody predicted the invasion.
No, and when I've traveled through Russia twice, and my first sense of Russia was that this is the wild East. You know, it doesn't feel like Europe. It feels more like India. And you've been to India, so you probably know what I'm talking about. We talked about this actually last time when we talked, that there's this strange sort of logic in India, how things sort of are chaotic, but they happen.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And it's the same way in Russia. Completely the same. It's very sort of, it has a chaotic and lively sense to it. And before people start, thinking that I'm against Russians or something, I am not. And as I said, I greatly admire many aspects of Russian culture and art and writings and painters and things. And there's aspects of Russia which are great, which you can see. And I have experience in Russia. I've toured Russia twice. I've been to St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, and Ichevsk, which is very far already in Udmurtia, which is very much to the east. And I've understood the just how large that area is and how crazy and wild it is. And it is ruled by a completely different logic than here. But I do like the Russian people. They're very friendly. They were very friendly towards us when we were there as Finnish people. They're very romantic people, way beyond the extent to which Europeans are. And I mean, and it's great. And it's a very strange place, and everybody talks to you, and you sit on the train, and like we always went to our gigs. I played with this band many years ago, this ambient sort of ritual ambient band, and we played in Petersburg, St. Petersburg. Then we took the night train to Moscow. We played there. Then took the night train to Kazan. Then took the night train to Ichevsk. And every night people would come in the restaurant cart and buy us vodka, and we would talk the whole night. And like there would be musicians and Orthodox priests and all kinds of strange local Russians who would help us carry our equipment and musical stuff, and just great people and very, very wonderful and just very bizarre. Also, like we ended up having a breakfast at the house of Kalashnikov. Like the rifle,
right.
The weapon that's killed more people than the nuclear bomb, really, like the developer of that weapon. And his grandson is like this hippie guy, the Shiva guy. And he was at our gig and, gave somebody mushrooms, and stuff like this. And next morning we go, to this sort of fenced off mansion in the middle of nowhere. And we're sitting and having tea, and we realize, we're actually sitting at this guy's house, who's the inventor of this Kalashnikov, the Kalashnikov himself, the rifle. Yeah. And, then he comes in and dressed in full camo, the guy, and he's like, in his 80s. This was shortly before he died.
Oh, is Mikhail Kalashnikov is still alive?
He was alive when we were there, yeah. It was a few years before he died.
Wow.
And he came in and started immediately screaming to everybody that we have to get out, and we're like Russian spies. And we're all like, long-haired, weird musicians from Finland, that have no connection to politics whatsoever. And then we all leave. And, as we leave, the grandson, who's sort of apologetic about his grumpy grandfather, sort of hands us these Kalashnikov magazines, which we then look at, and it's like, buy a bazooka to protect your home kind of stuff.
That sounds like the U.S.
Yeah, well, yeah, in that way. But it's just... My point being that Russia is a very wild and strange place, and there's a bunch of really good people there, and I feel bad that this conflict is happening, because it will turn a lot of people against Russians who really don't have a say in this situation.
Right. That's one of the really big tragedies of this, one of many tragedies, is, the level of sanctioning that is had, they're basically just trying to cut Russia out, or they are cutting Russia out of the world economy. And the level of, this is, I believe, the most severe sanctions that have ever been issued by the US and the EU. And people hear sanctions and it sounds to them like, oh, well, they get a black mark on their report card or something like that. But really what it means is intentional starvation. And, Ursula von der Leyen said, the point of these the point of these sanctions is not a deterrent. It's not to get Russia to stop doing this. It's to destroy Russia permanently. And von der Leyen said that. And so obviously the Russian people are already, if we're already talking about abject poverty, crocodile, things like this, I can't imagine what it's going to be like there for normal people.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but I'm sure that Putin was aware that this would happen. Like, I'm sure that he was aware that there would be sanctions. I think that he was probably surprised by the severity of the sanctions. I think they probably have, surprised him a little bit. But what else can, be beyond military invention? What else are people supposed to do? I think It's like, if that's the least you can do.
Right, for now. And
yes.
They're avoiding declaring the no-fly zone because Biden says, well, that will be open, that will be World War III, that will be open conflict. Yeah. But the war's been going on for a while now, so we will see what happens. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, I want to circle back to Dugin, but one thing I wanted to ask before we have that conversation, which I think is important context, is we were talking about propaganda, and obviously it's very hard to tell what's going on either side. There's obviously, we have a full lockstep social media propaganda machine now in the US, but, I've been looking at Russian media like Pravda, and I listened to Putin's speech at the beginning of the war, and I wanted to ask you about his narrative that they are denazifying the Ukraine, which presumably he's talking about Azov Battalion, and also his kind of take that they're liberating as you touched upon, he's saying that they're liberating Russians in Ukraine from genocide. I imagine you have a much, I would like to hear your take on that propaganda take, basically being closer to it, and your take on what Putin and the Russian state are saying there as their justification for the war.
Well, I find it interesting that the Nazis are still somehow involved in all of this. Right. On both sides, right. It's like Russia is denazifying Ukraine, and everybody's talking about Putin as Hitler in the West.
Yeah, it's bizarre on seeing, dyed in the wool American centrist liberals rooting for Azov Battalion on Reddit and things like this, where it's like people who were, 5 seconds ago calling Trump Hitler and saying that, that there's, obsessed with Nazis in the US and whites, and all of a sudden they're rooting for Nazis, presumably without even being aware of it. It's just another bizarre aspect of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, what else can you say? I mean, the whole thing, I think the historical precedent to Putin calling, denazification and all of this, I mean, the Russia, Soviet Union, they beat the Nazis. So that's a historical sort of, it's a reference to a history of invasion. But yeah, I do think it's this sort of we still live, and this is also one thing I talk about in the book, is that in a way we're still living in the post World War II era, like the trauma and the aftermath of that war is still alive in this way, where you will have a war 75 years after the end of the Second World War, and you still have both sides calling each other Nazis. Mm-hmm. Like, what is going on? Like, it really. And I'm sure there are. I just find this kind of a non-issue. I'm sure there's so-called Nazis on both sides, and Ukraine right now can afford to to be purist about who's a national. Like everybody who's Ukrainian right now is a nationalist, and that's as far as that goes. And the Azov battalion, whatever the war crimes they've done, which probably are true, and they've done horrible things, which happen in all wars, they're still fighting, and they're a fighting force, and that's the sad reality of the situation.
Right, and then Putin's bringing Chechens in, so yeah.
Yeah, that's not a good look.
No. Yeah, that's although I've seen people saying this is perhaps exaggerated to terrify people as propaganda, but it's still pretty scary.
It is pretty. I think it's scary, and it tells you about what Russia is in a way. I mean, Russia is an empire. It's not it's not like a country made up of a specific people. It's many peoples. So it's an empire. I mean, that's what an empire is. And so, what is the cohesive force now that binds Russia together? I don't know what that is anymore.
Right, and certainly there's the view of. So this probably is a good time to go back to Dugin, because there's kind of this view that perhaps it's this kind of Duginist Eurasian vision, but I kind of doubt that. I think if anything, Russia appears to be just a country run by organized crime. So if there, whatever, I think you were saying this kind of traditionalist viewpoint actually doesn't have a whole lot of power, but it does have a lot of power in Western intellectual circles. And, it's been easy in the US to be a little bit cynical about claims of, Russian influence or invasion, because since 2016, like literally, it has just been a nonstop drumbeat that anything that happens that cannot be controlled by the Democratic Party is Russian interference automatically, even when that is absurd. But at the same time, it's not totally absurd, because clearly it is happening. And I wanted to ask you about essentially Duginism and how your view of how it has kind of infiltrated and infested various intellectual circles in the West. So I wanted to ask you about that and what your take on that is, about the extent to which Duginism has infiltrated things, what it is, the effect that it has had, your take on the people who are either working as assets or have been taken in by it.
Yeah, I mean, Dugin is this crazy intellectual, very charismatic person, with a Rasputin-like beard. So there's all these precedents to him also. People associate him with kind of like a modern Rasputin, which is cool. You have this kind of a strange wizard, like, who has the ear of the leaders of a superpower. The thing is, I just think he's a kind of how much Dugin says for shock value and how much he actually is genuine about things is very hard to say. I can't say about his motivations. I do find him and his ideals at odds with the kind of traditionalism that I would subscribe to. I mean, I do consider myself some kind of pagan traditionalist. I've never labeled myself for anything, but I think paganism is ultimately about or the same as tradition. So of course that is in the idea that there is a perennial truth expressed in various pre-Christian and or just spiritual tradition generally, that there are spiritual traditions that give voice to a similar spiritual truth, and that for Europeans this is manifested in the various pagan pre-Christian spiritual traditions that we have, and that those ultimately speak about some kind of truth. But that is very different from being a Russian Orthodox imperialist, which is essentially just what Dugin is. But I can't really say how much of an influence he has. I think he has influence in the Russian intellectual circles in the Western, for sure. but how much is very hard to say. And yeah, I'm sure these ideas have affected the fringes of some political advocates, both in Russia and the US, like Steve Bannon. I mean, there was a book about what was it called, the War for Eternity. Did you read that book?
No, I'm not aware of it.
This is a book about the influence of traditionalism on Russian and US politics, specifically of Steve Bannon on Trump, and because Steve Bannon quoted Julius Evola and something like that, and in some article and stuff. So this is a book that I would that would be maybe interesting to read about this topic by this guy. Let me just see the name. Got too many books, Jason. Benjamin Teitelbaum. And
okay.
It's called War for Eternity, and he has sort of explored the subject of the actual political dimensions of these type of philosophies on politics in the current age. And I mean, it's difficult to tell. There's certainly been weird things happening in the last 5-6 years or so. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, there's Bannon, but I definitely saw Duginists kind of infiltrating American occult circles as far back as 2013, 2014. And that was very strange because it was so clearly a completely external and bizarre take on things. It's so obviously planted. But that said, it's hard to say. It's like we can, it's so easy to say, oh, well, someone's a Russian agent because for this, that, and the other. I mean, because they were, for instance, on RT. Well, I was on RT talking about the Aeon of Horus. So it's like, does that make me a Russian agent? I don't know. I don't think so. But that said, I think that there are clearly, you can clearly identify people who are kind of Russian propagandist agents, Duginists in Western circles. I mean, obvious examples, allegedly, I will say, this is all alleged, would be, for instance, Richard Spencer's ex-wife, or Dasha from Red Scare, which is a far left podcast in the US. So it's on both ends of the political spectrum. It's all alleged. I'm not saying it. It's just, it's alleged. But there are definitely people moving in circles in definitely America, but it always is at the very furthest edge of where people have pushed an ideology here. And that could be either far left politics, far right politics, chaos magic, the outer extremes of the occult, but it's always right at the final edge of where a subculture pushes an ideology. Then you start to actually see Russian influence. And it's, I think, undeniable. And that is pretty, I guess, obvious in retrospect, but pretty sinister. So I can't just, out of hand say that there aren't these massive Russian troll factories or propaganda factories working. And I'm sure they're working in overtime now. You said the thing about the deep fake about Zelensky, it's pretty amazing when you think that it's easy to say like, oh, well, reality is totally manufactured by the state, but it's actually much more, it's not all American propaganda. It's much closer to Robert Anton Wilson's line that reality is the line at which rival shamans have fought to a standstill. So it's like we're constantly being right? It's like we're constantly being bombarded by propaganda from multiple superpowers, as you say, like do not have our best interests in mind. And it's how anybody can keep the story straight in their head is kind of beyond me. I think and the response in America has just been, well, basically like just believe what we tell you and then just keep it at that, like trust authority. And people go for that.
Yeah.
It's comforting, I guess.
Thing. Yeah, this is a difficult thing because I mean, I've been trying to look at this situation as objectively as I can and understand different sides to it and look at all the motivations of Russia and what provoked it and all these things. And I do think that is one of the most difficult things, is just because we are surrounded by so much propaganda on every direction that it is very hard to really make out what's happening. And of course, like I noticed in myself this reaction, like, when everybody's starting to virtue signal about the same thing all at once.
Yeah.
And it's every actor, every Hollywood actor puts the thing on their profile and stuff. I've always been a bit of an outsider, so I have this contrarian reaction to things where I think, well, so much of what the mainstream media tells you about things is a lie, obviously, that, you kind of like, you have this reaction that this is probably a lie too, but not all things are lies. And, some things are like that for a reason. I think when it comes to this war, for instance, in particular, I think that's the case where it just, you can't just, I've tried to look at the thing, but you can't, it's hard for me to adopt any sort of contrarian position in this situation.
Yeah. That's
where I just find that this is a real war, which is displacing and killing a lot of people and destroying a lot of things, and which has the potential to spread and
it could get a lot bigger,
do a lot more. And then the thing is, like, we live in a time where it's strange. It's people still put their faith in these political leaders of these corrupt empires. This includes the US and Russia, and think that these things are going to, like, say they're going to be the saviors of them, that they're going to make everything better. And obviously that's not the case. Like, people will have to work in the shadow of these empires and try to make their own lives good for themselves, and nobody else is going to do that for them. And no political regime will have their best interest in mind in the current world, unfortunately. And the sad thing about this war nowadays, too, is that we have this whole nuclear war position, which is so utterly nihilistic. It's like, even during the Second World War, there were, my friend Gerhard Hallstatt, this writer and musician from Austria, he's written about this sort of Panzermaterialismus, like this sort of panzer materialism, how the war became so much about matter and about stuff, about, like, just, it wouldn't be a war in terms of you go and fight somebody, but it would be war on this massive scale of material objects and weaponry. And that is one of the worrying aspects about war nowadays, where it has no sort of honorable dimension anymore. It's just about utter destruction, of the earth. It's very like the end of modern warfare is so nihilistic.
Yeah, that is really
and materialistic.
Really,
it's not like you're fighting with rifles or something. It's not like that anymore.
Right. That is really scary, and the probably what makes this so much more severe, because we all have been living in essentially the held breath moment after World War II, where 3 generations have been saying, never again. We can't do war on this scale ever again, because now there's nuclear weapons, and essentially the NATO sphere of influence has been living in a kind of whatever you call it, kind of Pax Americana, Pax Europa, where the force of the atomic bomb protects them. But now, and that certainly seemed to be the case after the fall of the USSR, but now that's not, we are back in the specter of the war to end all wars, I think, for the first time certainly since the 80s. And I think people who are younger now, millennials, certainly Zoomers, don't remember that, and they don't have any context for the fact that people assumed that they were going to die in a nuclear war that killed everything on the planet, and that's the reality they lived under, and that was assumed, and people had in America, people had nuclear fallout drills in school, like as if, getting under your desk is going to do anything. But that was people grew up in the shadow of the bomb, and we only felt like it went away because the Soviet Union fell. But now we're right back there, and you see things like, Russians openly shooting at a Ukrainian nuclear facility, and it boggles the mind. So I think, but this is kind of what I was saying about my kind of knee-jerk Chomsky reaction to it at the beginning, where it was like, oh yeah, but actually not, oh yeah, like actually this is not something to be contrarian about. It is extremely serious and could get much more serious. And at the same time, we are not, as you say, I'm sure Europeans have a much more of a sense of this than Americans, but people in this war, including Americans, including Russians, are caught in the middle between two superpowers, neither of which has their best interests at heart. And so maybe that's a good place to just circle back to the beginning of the podcast, and which is and kind of what you were saying about spirituality, and also in Europe, how this will make potentially people reevaluate what being European actually means and what is special about it. And that is one thing that is true of war. I mean, it really clarifies where people stand, whether it's what we're talking about or, whether you're saying like every liberal is now a nationalist on Twitter. But why don't we circle back to spirituality and end on a positive note, shall we say?
Yeah, let's. I mean, obviously, this is difficult with such a subject, but yeah, I think there. I wanted to say that it is also good to think like things are not obvious. Like sometimes opposition creates a positive, healthy reaction. There's like we can think in terms of. I told you, I think this story last time when I was on your podcast, that in the Baltic countries, these traditions, spiritual traditions in the Baltics, are sort of in a way much better preserved and much more vital and sort of living among young people and the youth especially, and sort of much more appreciated than in Finland in a strange way. And I was thinking that is perhaps because they were suppressed, and because they were forbidden, that those people actually held on to those traditions that they had and thought that they were important and wanted to fight for them and to keep them alive. Whereas, an exposure to 60 years of Americanization will sort of slowly corrode that sense of a people's own sort of cultural inner life, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And I think so there is this problem that I mean, neither are good. Neither the American all-pervasive cultural influence nor a totalitarian regime. Like, I'm not really rooting for either party, but it's good to consider. The German band Rammstein,
yes,
heavy band.
Yeah, of course.
They have this song America, and the video is like, we are all living in America, and it's all these like, African tribesmen eating pizza from Pizza Hut, and like Muslims wearing Nikes, and like,
yeah, I thought it was interesting that the first thing that America did with Russia is like, okay, you're cut off from McDonald's and Starbucks,
yeah.
And it's like
too bad,
right?
It's like, thanks for doing us the favor,
right.
So yeah, that's not good.
That's it. No more French fries.
If there is a positive thing to this, and there always like there is, I mean, change is inevitable. We live in a world. Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher of Greece, said that war is the king and father of all. And unfortunately, throughout human history, that has been the case, that war is the force that shapes change and continents and cultures. There's never been a moment where this has not been the case. Now, that is not necessarily a good thing, but it's a reality that we have to live with. And if I can see something positive, about this thing is the reaction of Europe to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because I can see that people are taking this position that this is us, that this is an attack on a European country, and the sense that we are Europe. This kind of almost speaks of an emergence of a new kind of consciousness of Europeans, which I would gladly accept, because I think that this kind of small-minded, very insular nationalism is not good. And if you look at the previous two world wars that were fought basically between brothers, like in Europe, it was brother peoples fighting indistinguishable from one another. Basically, they had different languages, but that was as far as it went. So it's brothers fighting brothers, and I would hope for an emergence of a new kind of a European vision, where yes, we are nations and we have our specific cultures and customs, but we are also part of a bigger cultural and spiritual unity, which has a sense of common history and destiny and kinship, and that we can bond over that on a higher plane and not be and understand ourselves as a greater power. And perhaps this is a pipe dream, but someday I would hope that there would emerge a kind of a European power to assert itself instead of being between these sort of great superpowers.
Yeah,
so
I think
if there's anything, that I hope this might stir, is that this might get Europeans to really consider what they are, who they are, what they're ready to fight for. And, there's a lot of Finns that have left to fight. Well, I don't know a lot, but there are some Finns that have left to fight for the Ukrainian war.
Yeah. And British
so this
and
is
so on.
Yes. Yeah. And other Europeans. So this is clearly something, people feel for this. They feel that this is a fight that they're engaged, that this is has to do with them in some sense. And I think that is a positive, expansive, feeling of a good thing to have. Because I would like to see a Europe where we can get past these petty sort of small-minded concerns and recognize our larger spiritual unity and connection with each other, which is profound and deep, which I've been very lucky and blessed to witness as I've traveled through Europe many times, writing this book and meeting people, and at fires and by holy trees and mountaintops and by lakes and sacred groves, and just meeting people and being at these power places. I've realized that this is a reality that exists throughout this old continent.
Yeah, and I think that it seems to me extremely likely that this will, at the very least, revitalize the European Union project, because it's been clear to me that it's been kind of hanging on life support a little bit and in danger of falling apart post-Brexit, post-austerity measures, things like this. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects even just the politics of the EU, rather than, which I don't know how you feel about, but I don't necessarily, I'm not arguing for one side or the other, but it seems like it would make sense that would be, those bonds would be stronger.
Yeah, I'm for European unity. I'm not necessarily for the European Union as it is.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I think it's dominated by economic concerns only. And its cultural vision is very economically dominated. It's not necessarily going to enrich the peoples of Europe at all.
Right.
But I would hope that a European Union would be able to emerge one day that would actually serve the people and the countries and the lands of Europe. So in a way, I'm pro and against the EU in this sense,
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way about. Well, the best thing I've ever heard about, you must know Jazz Coleman from Killing Joke.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he had a great line on this where he said, against a new world order, or excuse me, he's against one world government, but he's for one world community, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
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 So, well.
Yeah. Can I read to you a little passage which I think might suit? I sent you the same thing, and this is also from Hermann Hesse's Demian, likewise. But I think it sort of sums up a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about.
Sure.
Okay, I'll just start sort of mid-sentence here. And please excuse my poor English. All of that was merely superficial, just as the question of the external and political aims of the war remained superficial. Deep down, something was evolving, something like a new humanity. Because I could see many people, and a number of them died alongside me, who had gained the emotional insight that hatred and rage, killing and destroying, were not linked to the specific objects of that rage. No, the object, just like the aims, were completely accidental. Those primal feelings, even the wildest of them, weren't directed against the enemy. Their bloody results were merely an outward materialization of people's inner life, the split within their souls, which desired to rage and kill, destroy and die, so that they could be reborn. A gigantic bird was fighting its way out of the egg, and the egg was the world, and the world had to fall to pieces.
Yep. Well, and on that note.
Good times.
Yeah. Well, where can people find out more about your books?
Yes. So I have been translating the book, Holy Europe, into English. I will finish the translation during the spring, which in Finland means basically until summer.
Okay.
And then hopefully the book will be published not very long after that. It is a quite big book. It's over 400 pages. It is a massive work. There's also a lot of photographs taken by my wife, Aki Cederberg, which make it into sort of a talisman, which I also wanted to make this book into. So people should look for that book when it comes out. And my first book, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, is available everywhere where good books are sold. And people can visit my website at akicederberg.com. And they can look at my social media on Facebook and Instagram, where I do public posts about things that I'm currently engaged in, and podcasts and interviews and things like that. And I was very happy to talk to you, Jason. It's always good. We have so much in sort of similar experiences, and yet your take is sort of, from a different perspective than mine, but I can really appreciate talking to you. It's always good.
Yeah, definitely. And that was great. Thank you for being on. It's a great conversation, and let's definitely do it again soon.
Yes. Take care.
Sounds good. Okay. Thanks again. Talk to you later.
Okay.